There is a place on our earth where the silence is so deep it feels older than time itself. A place where the sun circles the horizon like a pale gold coin, and the air is so clear that distant mountains look like they are made of cut glass. It is the bottom of the world, the White South. Tonight we are going to travel back to the year 1914. We are going to step aboard a wooden ship built of oak and pine, smelling of tar and rope and coal smoke. We are going to join 28 men who sailed away from the noise of the modern world and drifted into the white silence of the Antarctic. This is the story of the Endurance. It is a story often told as a high adventure, a tale of danger and survival, and it is those things. But tonight we will look at it differently. We will look at the quiet moments, the warmth of a stove in a frozen sea, the sound of a banjo playing in the polar night, the resilience of the human spirit when the world turns to ice. So, pull the covers up to your chin. Let the warmth of your own bed remind you of the safety we often take for granted. Let the winds of the Antarctic howl outside while we remain safe and warm inside the story. Take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and let us sail south. To understand the journey, we must first understand the vessel. She was not merely a vehicle. She was a world unto herself. In the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Southern Ocean, she was the only speck of warmth, the only geometric shape in a chaotic universe of water and ice. Her name was the Endurance. She was born in the cold fjords of Norway at the Framnes shipyard, a place where men had been building ships to fight the ice for generations. She was not built for speed. She was not built for grace. She was built for one thing: resistance. If you were to stand on the dock and look up at her, you would see a hull painted a stark, deep black, a shadow against the sky. But it was what lay beneath the paint that mattered. She was constructed of massive planks of oak and Norwegian fir, layered upon one another until the whole was nearly 2.5 feet thick. Run your hand along the side of the ship in your mind. Feel the rough, cold texture of the wood. It is solid, immovable, like the trunk of an ancient tree. The outer layer was sheathed in greenheart, a wood so dense, so heavy that it sinks in water. It is a wood that feels like iron to the touch, chosen because it is the only thing in nature that can withstand the grinding teeth of the polar pack ice. She smelled of the forest. Even after months at sea, the scent of the timber remained, a deep, resinous aroma of pine and sap that mingled with the salt air. It was a smell that reminded the sailors of land, of trees, of the solid earth they were leaving behind. Above the deck, her 3 masts rose high into the gray sky. She was a barquentine, a hybrid of the old world and the new. Her forward mast was square-rigged, carrying heavy canvas sails that could catch the roaring winds of the 40s and 50s. The aft masts were fore and aft rigged, designed for maneuverability. When the wind blew through the rigging, the ship sang. It was a low, mournful hum, the vibration of the wind against the taut hemp ropes and the steel cables. Thrum, thrum. It was the voice of the ship, a constant background note to their lives. But the Endurance had a secret heart. Deep in her belly, beneath the waterline, lay a coal-fired steam engine. It was a heavy black beast of cast iron and brass. When it was running, it gave the ship a pulse. You could feel it through the soles of your boots, a rhythmic, reassuring thumping. Thump, thump. It was the sound of power, the sound of heat, the sound of civilization pushing against the wild. While the dogs ruled the deck, a different breed of men ruled the depths. Deep below the waterline, down a steep steel ladder, lay the stokehold. This was the domain of the Black Gang, the firemen and stokers who kept the heart of the Endurance beating. It was a world of stark contrasts. While the deck watchmen shivered in their parkas, their eyebrows frosted with ice, the men in the stokehold worked stripped to the waist, their skin glistening with sweat in the suffocating heat.
The air down here was thick with coal dust. It tasted of sulfur and iron. The only light came from the open maws of the furnaces, which cast a flickering, demonic orange glow against the steel bulkheads. The rhythm of the stokehold was hypnotic. Scrape, swing, whoosh. The fireman would drive his shovel into the pile of coal, swing it in a smooth arc, and feed the fire. Scrape, swing, whoosh. It was a dance of labor that never stopped. Every shovelful of coal was a promise. It was energy that would turn the propeller one more time. It was heat that would warm the radiators in the wardroom. It was the lifeblood of the ship. These men, covered in grime, with eyes shining white in their blackened faces, were the unsung heroes of the voyage. They fought the cold, not with fur or wool, but with fire. The coal bunkers surrounding the engine room were filled with tons of black coal, a stored reserve of sunlight and warmth that they would carry with them into the dark. The smell of the coal smoke, acrid, sulphurous, but strangely comforting, would trail behind the ship like a dark ribbon, marking their path across the pristine white snow.
If the exterior of the Endurance was a fortress, the interior was a home. Step through the heavy companionway door. Hear the latch click shut behind you, sealing out the wind. The howl of the gale drops instantly to a muffled murmur. The biting cold is replaced by a dry, enveloping warmth. You are now in the living quarters. The walls here are not black iron, but varnished wood that glows with a honey-colored light in the lantern shine. The air is thick and cozy. It smells of pipe tobacco, a sweet cherry wood scent, and damp wool drying by the fire. It smells of baking bread and strong, dark tea. The heart of this world was the wardroom. It was a small space, barely large enough for the officers and scientists to sit around the long mahogany table, but it was the center of their universe. In the corner stood the stove. It was the altar of the ship, a heavy iron box, always hot, always radiating a fierce, dry heat. On its flat top, copper kettles simmered constantly, sending plumes of steam drifting up to the wooden beams of the ceiling. The gentle hiss of the steam and the occasional crack of a shifting coal were the sounds of safety. The cabins opened off this central room. They were tiny, little more than wooden boxes with a bunk and a shelf, but the men had made them their own. They were nests. On the shelves, you would see the artifacts of their lives, a framed photograph of a wife or a mother, the glass cracked but carefully taped, a stack of books, poetry, navigation manuals, novels by Dickens and Dostoevsky, worn at the corners from reading and rereading, a heavy woolen sweater folded neatly, a pipe and a tin of tobacco. These small spaces were their retreat. when the storm raged outside, when the waves crashed over the bow and the ship rolled 20 degrees to the side, a man could retreat to his bunk, draw the curtain, and be in his own private world. He could listen to the creaking of the ship's timbers, a sound like an old house settling in the wind, and feel the warmth of the blankets, safe in the knowledge that the Endurance was holding him. But the 28 men were not the only living souls on board. If you walked along the main deck, navigating the narrow spaces between the lifeboats and the crates, you would be greeted by a cacophony of life that rivaled a busy city street. The Endurance carried 69 Canadian sled dogs. They were not pets, they were engines of fur and muscle, destined to pull the sledges across the Antarctic continent. But on the ship, they were a chaotic, vibrant community. Their kennels were built along the deck, creating a narrow alleyway that the crew called Dogville. To walk through Dogville was an assault on the senses. There was the heavy, musky scent of wet fur and straw. There was the steam rising from 69 panting mouths in the cold air. And there was the noise. It was a constant backdrop to the voyage, a mixture of excited yips, low growls, and the rhythmic thumping of tails against wooden boards. Each dog had a name and a personality that the crew knew by heart. There was Shakespeare, the intellectual of the pack, who would sit quietly and watch the horizon with a soulful gaze. There was Hercules, a massive beast with a chest like a barrel, who pulled harder than any 2 other dogs combined. And there was Samson, the red-furred giant who ruled Dogville with a low growl and a bare tooth. At night, a strange phenomenon would occur. One dog would start to howl, a long, mournful note directed at the moon or the Southern Cross. Then another would join in, and another. Within seconds, the entire ship would be engulfed in a dog chorus, a haunting, primal song that rose from the deck and drifted out over the empty ocean. For the men in their bunks below, it wasn't an annoying sound. It was a reminder of life. In the vast, dead silence of the ocean, the howling of the dogs was a defiant shout that said, "We are here. We are alive." A ship is wood and iron, but a voyage is flesh and blood. The 28 men who sailed on the Endurance were a tapestry of personalities, stitched together by a common purpose. In the quiet hours of the evening, after the work was done, you could see the true nature of the crew. There was the boss, Sir Ernest Shackleton. He was a man of immense energy, but on the ship he often sat quietly at the head of the table. He had a way of listening that made you feel you were the only person in the world. He would smoke his cigarette, his blue eyes scanning the room, watching the dynamic of his family. He knew that morale was as important as coal. He was the anchor. There was Frank Worsley, the captain, a New Zealander with a face weathered by 1,000 storms. He was a man who lived in a world of angles and stars. In the evenings, he would be found hunched over his charts, a pair of brass dividers in his hand, measuring distances, calculating drifts. He treated the ocean with a casual familiarity, as if the Atlantic were his backyard. He had a deep, booming laugh that could shake the icicles off the rigging, but when he worked, he was a statue of concentration. There was Tom Crean, the Irish giant. He was a man of few words, but his presence was a comfort to everyone. He was built like a boulder, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could crush stone. Yet he was the gentlest man on the ship. He had taken charge of the puppies born on the voyage. You would often find him in the 'tween decks, sitting on a crate, cooing softly to a pile of squirming fur, feeding them milk from a bottle, The contrast between the massive, scarred sailor and the tiny, whimpering puppies was a sight that softened the hardest hearts. Then there was Chippy McNeish, the carpenter. He was a Scotsman, old and curmudgeonly, with a face like a piece of driftwood. He was rarely seen without a tool in his hand. He spoke the language of wood. While others rested, he would be planing a piece of timber, the rhythmic shh of the plane creating a pile of curly, fragrant shavings at his feet. He was constantly reinforcing the ship, building shelves, fixing latches. He trusted the wood more than he trusted people. And, essential to the soul of the expedition, there was Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist. He was a small, wiry man with a quick wit, but his true contribution was his banjo. It was a 5-string instrument, battered and worn. In the evenings, when the silence of the ocean pressed in against the hull, Hussey would take it out. He didn't play loud, raucous tunes. He played soft, lilting melodies, old folk songs, music hall ballads, tunes that reminded the man of rainy streets in London or green fields in Yorkshire. The plink-plunk of the banjo was a bright golden sound in the gray world. It was a thread that tied them to home. The men would hum along, their eyes closed, drifting away on the notes. It was December 5th, 1914, when the final tether to the known world was cut. The Endurance lay at anchor in the harbor of Grytviken, South Georgia. This was a whaling station, a grim industrial outpost on the edge of the Antarctic. It was a place of smoke and steam, where the water was red with blood and the air hung heavy with the smell of rendering oil. But to the men, it was civilization. It was the last place where they could send a letter, the last place they could hear a new voice. The departure was not a grand affair with cheering crowds and brass bands. It was a quiet, somber moment. The order was given to weigh anchor. The steam winch rattled and hissed, pulling the heavy chain up from the dark water, link by wet link. Clank, clank, clank. The sound echoed off the steep, snow-capped mountains that surrounded the harbor. The engine room telegraph rang. Ding, ding, slow ahead. The propeller began to turn. The water churned at the stern. The ship began to move, slowly at first, then gathering momentum. As they glided out of the harbor, the men stood at the rail, looking back. They watched the lights of the whaling station. There were the yellow squares of windows, the red glow of the furnace fires, the lanterns swinging on the docks. Those lights were the last stars of humanity. Slowly, inevitably, they began to fade. The ship moved past the headland, and the open ocean embraced them. The swell lifted the hull, a long, slow heave that signaled they were leaving the shelter of the land. The lights of Grytviken shrank to pinpricks, then to a faint glow on the horizon, and then they were gone. Ahead lay only the gray, heaving expanse of the Southern Ocean. The transition was absolute. One moment they were connected to the world of telegrams and cities and wars. The next, they were alone. The sky above them was a vast, vaulted dome of gray cloud. The sea was a restless, rolling plain of steel-colored water. The wind picked up, whistling through the shrouds, cold and sharp. But there was no fear on board. There was a sense of readiness. The ship was strong. The larder was full. The coal bunkers were heaped high. As the night fell, the Endurance turned her bow south. She rose and fell with the rhythm of the sea, a cradle rocking in the deep. The men went below to their warm cabins, to their books and their pipes. They were 28 specks of life in a universe of water, sailing toward the white silence that waited for them at the bottom of the world.
For days, the Endurance sailed through a world of gray water and gray sky. The ocean was a restless, heaving thing, breathing with the long swell of the Atlantic. But slowly, imperceptibly, the rhythm began to change. The first sign was the temperature. The air grew sharper, biting at the nose and cheeks with a new intensity. It was a dry, crystalline cold that felt clean in the lungs. The wind lost the damp, salty smell of the open ocean and began to carry a new scent. The scent of ozone, of ancient snow, of purity. And then they appeared. The first icebergs. They did not look like mere chunks of frozen water. They looked like floating cathedrals, vast white fortresses drifting on the dark sea. To the men standing on the deck, they were a revelation. Some were tabular bergs, immense, flat-topped islands of ice that stretched for miles. They rose 100 feet straight up from the water, their cliffs sheer and white, looking like the white cliffs of Dover set adrift. They were so large that the Endurance, a sturdy ship of 144 feet, looked like a child's toy bobbing in their shadow. Others were weathered into fantastic, dream-like shapes. There were spires and arches, castles and caves. The wind and the waves had carved them into sculptures that defied gravity. But it was the color that mesmerized the crew. We think of ice as white, but here it was a spectrum of blues that had no name. There was the pale, milky blue of the surface snow, soft and powdery. There was the deep, electric sapphire of the compressed ice at the waterline, glowing with an inner light. And in the shadows, where the sun could not reach, there was a violet darkness that looked like the night sky itself. The ship moved among them carefully. The silence of this place was profound. It was not an empty silence, but a heavy, waiting silence. The only sounds were the wash of water along the hull and the occasional distant thunder of an iceberg calving, a sound like cannon fire that rolled across the water and faded into nothingness. As they pushed further south, the open water began to disappear. They entered the pack ice. This was not a solid sheet, but a jigsaw puzzle of frozen ocean. Millions of floes, ranging from the size of a dinner table to the size of a city, all drifting, grinding, and shifting with the currents. The sound of the ship changing course was the sound of the Voyage changing. The rhythmic rise and fall of the ocean swell vanished, replaced by a steady, level glide. The ship began to work. She was designed for this. Her bow was shaped like a sledgehammer. When she met a floe of ice, she would not just crash into it. She would rise up, her heavy timbered bow sliding onto the ice, and then, with the weight of the ship, she would crush it beneath her. The sound was unique, a tearing, ripping noise, like the sound of heavy silk being torn by a giant hand. Crunch, hiss. The ice would shatter into geometric blocks, tumbling along the side of the ship, turning over to reveal their dark underside colors before bobbing in the wake. Day after day, this was their world, a world of white and gray and blue. The sun circled the sky, never setting, bathing the world in a perpetual pale light. It was a dreamlike state.
The men fell into a trance of navigation. The man in the crow's nest, high above the deck in a barrel, would shout directions: starboard, port, steady, his voice thin in the cold air. The ship would weave through the leads, the narrow channels of dark water that opened up between the floes. Sometimes the water was as black as ink, reflecting the white spars of the ship like a perfect mirror. Sometimes it was covered in pancake ice, thousands of small circular disks of ice with raised rims bumping gently against each other, making a soft, whispering sound. Hush, hush, hush.
This frozen world was not dead. It was teeming with a strange, quiet life. The wildlife here was unafraid. They had never seen humans, never learned the fear of the hunter. Weddell seals, fat and sleek like giant slugs, lay on the ice floes, basking in the pale sun. As the ship approached, they would merely lift their heads, their large, dark eyes watching this wooden intruder with mild curiosity. They would let out soft, musical trills, strange, electronic-sounding chirps and whistles that echoed underwater and could be heard through the hull of the ship at night. It was the song of the deep, a lullaby from the creatures of the ice. Adelie penguins, the comedians of the Antarctic, would gather in small groups to watch the ship pass. They stood upright like little men in tuxedos, chattering to one another, waddling along the edge of the ice to keep pace with the Endurance. Their harsh, staccato calls, ark, 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 were often the only sharp sounds in a world of muffled softness. Sometimes a pod of killer whales would surface in a lead, their black dorsal fins cutting the water like scythes. They would exhale, psh, sending plumes of mist into the cold air before slipping silently back into the depths. And always there was the snow. It fell not in flakes, but in fine, dry dust. It coated the rigging in white velvet. It piled up on the deck. It softened every edge, muffled every sound. The ship became a ghost ship, a white vessel sailing through a white world. As January 1915 wore on, the nature of the ice changed. It was no longer a collection of loose rafts drifting in water. It was becoming a continent. The leads, those dark veins of open water, began to heal over. The process of freezing was mesmerizing to watch. It started with frazzle ice, tiny needles of ice floating in the water, giving it the appearance of grease or soup. This would thicken into sludge, a heavy, damp layer that dampened the waves. Then the sludge would congeal into pancake ice, round disks with raised edges that bumped and jostled against one another. Finally, the pancakes would freeze together, cementing into a solid white sheet. The Endurance fought this process. She was a brave ship. She would charge the new ice, breaking it apart, creating a path where there was none. But the ice was relentless. For every mile they gained, the winter reclaimed too. The wind, which had been their ally, pushing the ice apart, suddenly died. A great calm settled over the Weddell Sea. It was a beautiful, deadly calm. Without the wind to churn the ocean, the freezing accelerated. The temperature dropped to 14 degrees below zero. The water between the floes turned into a glue-like slush. The ship's progress slowed to a crawl. The man on deck could hear the change in the engine's rhythm. It was no longer a steady, confident beat. It was laboring, chug, chug, chug.
The propeller thrashed against the thickening sludge, fighting for every inch. The men began to feel the change. The easy banter on the deck stopped. They stood at the rail, watching the ice close in behind them. The path they had just cut was vanishing, sealed by the cold, as if it had never existed. There was a sense of inevitability. The ocean was closing its doors.
On the morning of January 19th, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sky was a pale, washed-out violet. The air was utterly still. The Endurance was navigating a narrow lead between two massive floes. She pushed forward, the ice screaming against her sides. She made it halfway through, and then she stopped. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a violent impact. It was a soft, yielding halt. The slush around her had hardened just enough to grip the hull. She was held, gently but firmly. Captain Worsley signaled the engine room for full power. The ship shuddered. The black smoke poured from the funnel, staining the pristine sky. The propeller churned the water into a frenzy of white foam, but the ship did not move. She was wedged. "Stop engines," Worsley said softly. The order was relayed. The fires were banked. The pistons slowed and halted. And then the sound that had been their heartbeat for thousands of miles, the rhythmic thumping of the steam engine, ceased. The silence that followed was absolute. It is hard to describe the silence of the Antarctic when the machinery stops. It is a physical weight. The hum of the ship, the vibration of the floorboards, the background noise of life, it all vanished in a second. The men stood on the deck, listening. They heard the blood rushing in their own ears. They heard the soft hiss of snow settling on the deck. They heard the distant, mournful cry of a seal. They looked over the rail. The dark water was gone. The ship was surrounded by white. The ice had closed in behind them, sealing the path they had just cut. The lead had vanished. Shackleton walked to the rail and looked out. He didn't rage. He didn't shout. He simply lit a cigarette, the smoke rising straight up in the still air. He knew. They all knew. The Endurance was no longer a ship. She was a station. She was a house. She was a speck of warmth in a frozen universe. The sun began to dip lower, casting the shadow of the masts across the ice, long, thin fingers of darkness reaching out to the east. The stars began to appear, one by one, pinpricks of ice-cold light in the darkening vault of the sky. The men went below to dinner. The mood was not despair, but a quiet acceptance. They were the men of the Endurance, and they would endure. They ate their stew, they drank their tea, and they prepared for bed. Outside, the ice tightened its grip just a fraction, a hug, an embrace. The ship groaned once, a deep, timbered sound, like a tree settling in the wind, and then went silent. That first night, the ship felt different. Without the engine, the warmth of the interior changed. It became still. The vibration that had rattled the teacups and hummed in the bunks was gone. Lying in their cabins, the men could hear the ocean in a new way. They could hear the ice pressing against the hull. It wasn't a violent sound yet. It was a gentle creaking, a settling. It sounded like a house cooling down after a hot day. Tick, creak, tick. They were drifting. Even though they were stuck, the entire ice pack was moving, rotating slowly clockwise in the Weddell Sea.
They were passengers on a continent of ice, drifting towards an unknown destination. The Ritz, the nickname for the wardroom, became even cozier. The stove seemed to burn brighter. The laughter seemed a little louder. They were drawing the circle of their world tighter. Outside, the temperature dropped to 20 below. The rigging froze into bars of iron. The dogs curled up in their kennels, noses tucked under tails, becoming balls of fur. The Endurance was beset. The trap had snapped shut, but it had done so with the gentleness of a falling snowflake. The long winter had begun.
February and March passed in a strange limbo. The ship was firmly stuck, but the sun still rose and set. These were the twilight months, the slow fade from day to night. The men established a routine on the ice. They lowered a ramp from the ship to the floe, turning the frozen ocean into their front yard. The dogs were moved off the ship and onto the ice. The carpenter, Chippy McNeish, built dog glues, small igloos made of blocks of ice and snow for each dog. It was a village on the ice. Dogville became a bustling town. The men would go down to the ice in the mornings to feed the dogs, their boots crunching on the snow. They played soccer on the flat expanse of the floe. The ball would skid across the ice, the men slipping and sliding, laughing, their breath pluming in the cold air. It was a surreal scene, a game of football being played in the middle of the ocean, 1,000 miles from the nearest stadium, with only the penguins and the seals as spectators. The scientists worked. They cut holes in the ice to dredge the bottom of the sea. They pulled up strange alien creatures, starfish with 20 arms, sponges made of glass, rocks that had been dropped by glaciers 1,000,000 years ago. They were discovering a world that no human eye had ever seen. But the main event was the sky. As autumn turned to winter, the sunsets became spectacular. The sun would skim the horizon, painting the sky in colors that looked like fire. Deep purples, burning oranges, bruised reds. The ice reflected these colors, turning the world into a kaleidoscope of light. And then the darkness began to win. Each day the sun rose a little lower. Each day the twilight lasted a little longer. The shadows stretched out, long and blue. On May 1st, the sun rose for the last time. It was a small red disk, barely peeking over the edge of the world. It hovered there for a moment, as if saying goodbye, and then it dipped below the horizon. It would not return for 4 months. The long polar night had officially begun. The world was now lit only by the moon, the stars, and the ghostly green curtains of the aurora australis dancing overhead. The Endurance was now a tiny spark of light in a world of infinite darkness.
The transition from autumn to winter in the Antarctic is not a sudden event. It is a slow, melancholic fading of the light. Throughout April, the men watched the sun with a growing sense of reverence. It was no longer the harsh, blinding orb of the summer. It was a low, golden companion that skimmed the horizon, casting long, theatrical shadows across the ice. But the geometry of the solar system is relentless. The Earth tilted away, and the sun sank lower. On May 1st, the final day arrived. The sky was clear, a dome of pale, frozen blue. The men gathered on the deck, silent and watchful. they saw the upper rim of the sun appear above the jagged line of the ice pack. It was a deep, burning red, like a dying ember. It lingered there for a few moments, bathing the white world in a flush of rose and violet. And then it slipped away. The light did not vanish instantly. It left behind a twilight that lasted for hours, a soft, bruised purple that slowly deepened into indigo and then into the black of true night. The psychological shift was profound. For the next 4 months, 120 days, there would be no dawn, there would be no noon, there would be only the night. But this darkness was not empty. It was a velvet darkness, rich and heavy. Without the competition of the sun, the other lights of the universe stepped forward to take the stage. The stars in the Antarctic sky are not like the stars seen from the inhabited world. In the dry, crystal-clear air, they do not twinkle, they burn. They are steady, piercing points of light. The Milky Way is not a faint smear, but a bright architectural band of diamond dust arching overhead, so bright it casts a faint shadow on the snow. And then there was the moon. In the polar winter, the moon does not just appear for a night. It circles the sky for days at a time, never setting. It became their silver sun. Under the full moon, the ice pack transformed into a landscape of polished silver and deep ink-black shadows. It was a ghostly, beautiful world, silent and still, illuminated by a cold, spectral light that made the Endurance look like a ship carved from pearl. And there were the curtains of the south, the aurora australis. They would appear without warning. A faint green glow on the horizon would suddenly flare up, expanding into vast, shimmering curtains of light that rippled across the zenith. Green, yellow, and sometimes a rare, terrifying red. They moved with a silent, fluid grace, like silk blowing in a slow wind. The men would stand on the deck, heads tilted back, their breath freezing in the air, mesmerized by the silent symphony playing above them. It was a reminder that although they were trapped in a place of supreme beauty. With the darkness came the cold. The temperature dropped steadily, 20 below, 30 below, 40 below zero. The Endurance was no longer a ship navigating the sea. She was a fortress standing against the freeze. Shackleton gave the order to winterize. They would turn the ship into a house. The first task was insulation. The primary enemy was not the ice outside, but the condensation inside. The warmth of the men's bodies in the stove would hit the freezing steel of the hull and turn into ice. To combat this, they became architects of snow. The crew took shovels and began to pile snow onto the decks. They didn't just clear it, they packed it down. They created a thick, heavy blanket of snow that covered the entire upper deck, insulating the living quarters below from the biting wind. It was like burying the ship in a cozy duvet of white. Inside, they rearranged their world. The crew moved from the forecastle, the forward part of the ship, which was colder, into the 'tween decks at midships. They built new bunks, creating a dormitory that was warmer and more communal. They called this new arrangement the Ritz. It was a joke, but it was also a statement of pride. They were determined to live with dignity. They hung heavy felt curtains to stop drafts. They polished the wood. They laid out carpets. The center of the Ritz was the wardroom. It became the living room, the dining room, and the library. The walls were lined with books, encyclopedias, novels, scientific texts. In the center stood the long table, the heart of their social life. But the true soul of the ship was the stove. It was a large cast-iron bogey stove fed with coal from the bunkers. In the deep winter, when the temperature outside was low enough to freeze mercury, that stove was the only source of heat for 1,000 miles. It glowed, literally. In the dim light of the cabin, the iron belly of the stove would turn a dull cherry red. It radiated a fierce, dry heat that dried the damp wool socks hanging above it and toasted the bread for breakfast. The smell of the stove was the smell of home. It was a mix of coal smoke, hot iron, and the savory aroma of whatever was cooking in the pots on top. To come in from the frozen deck, sliding down the ladder into the wardroom, was to be hit by a wall of this warmth. It was a physical sensation of safety. While the men made their home inside the wooden hull, another community was thriving on the ice outside. The 69 dogs could not live on the ship. It was too cramped and too warm for their thick coats. So the men built them a city. They called it Dogville. It was a sprawling settlement of dog loos, kennels built from blocks of ice and packed snow. Each dog had his own house, a small dome that protected him from the wind. The dogs, with their thick fur, were perfectly adapted to the cold. They would curl up inside their dog loos, their body heat warming the small space until the walls glazed over with a layer of ice, sealing them in. Under the light of the moon, Dogville looked like a miniature village of glowing mounds. The routine of Dogville was a highlight of the day. Even in the darkness, the men would go down the gangplank, a wooden ramp they had built from the ship to the ice, to feed and exercise the animals. The bond between the men and the dogs deepened in the winter. Each man was assigned a team. They were responsible for their care, their food, and their morale. Tom Crean, the giant Irishman, would spend hours down on the ice. He would sit by the entrance of a dogloo, talking to the dogs in a low, rumbling voice. He would check their paws for ice cuts, massage their muscles, and feed them their ration of seal meat and blubber. The dogs, in turn, provided a vital connection to the natural world. They were not depressed by the darkness. They were full of energy. When the men arrived, the dogs would leap from their kennels, barking and wagging their tails, eager to play. They would harness them to the sledges and run them across the ice floes. In the moonlight, the sledges would fly over the snow, the dogs panting, their breath streaming like smoke, the runners hissing on the ice. It was a rush of speed and freedom in a world that was otherwise still.
The ship had a heartbeat, and that heartbeat was the night watch. Every hour of the 24, one man was awake while the others slept. His duty was to watch the ice, to check the stove, and to ensure the safety of the ship. Imagine being that watchman. It is 3 a.m. The rest of the crew is asleep in their bunks. The only sound in the wardroom is the rhythmic breathing of 27 men and the soft click-click of the cooling stove. You put on your heavy coat, your fur mitts, and your hat. You climb the ladder and push open the hatch to the deck. The cold hits you like a physical blow. It is 45 degrees below zero. The air is so cold it freezes the moisture in your nose instantly. You step out onto the snow-covered deck. The silence is absolute. There is no wind tonight. The ship is held fast in the ice, motionless. Above you, the Milky Way is a river of light. To the south, the aurora is dancing, a silent curtain of green fire. You walk the length of the ship. The snow crunches loudly under your boots. Scrunch, scrunch, scrunch. The sound echoes in the stillness. You look over the rail at Dogville. The dogs are all asleep, curled deep in their snow houses. The village is silent.
You look out at the horizon. It is a jagged line of white ice against black sky. You are the only conscious human being in this entire hemisphere of the world. It is a lonely feeling, but also a peaceful one. You are the guardian of the sleep. You check the mooring ropes. You check the ice around the rudder. You look for any cracks in the flow. Everything is still. You go back to the hatch. You take one last look at the stars, feeling the immense, crushing scale of the universe. Then you slip back inside, closing the heavy door against the night. You descend into the warmth. You stir the stove, adding a fresh shovel of coal. The fire flares up, orange and welcoming. You settle into the chair by the fire, pick up a book, and wait for the morning that will not bring the sun, but will bring your brothers back to life. This was the rhythm of the winter, a rhythm of warmth and cold, of silence and song, of waiting and enduring. They had built a fortress of habit and wood, and for a long time it was enough to keep the terror of the ice at bay.
In the deep Antarctic winter, morning does not come with light. It comes with a sound. At 7 a.m. sharp, the night watchman would step into the center of the wardroom. He would reach for the heavy brass bell hanging by the door and ring it. Clang, 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 clang. The sound was bright and sharp, cutting through the heavy, warm air of the sleeping quarters. In the bunks lining the walls, 28 mounds of blankets would begin to stir. There was no sudden movement, no rushing. It was a slow, collective awakening. The men would emerge from their cocoons of wool and reindeer fur. The first sensation of the day was always the smell. Before you even opened your eyes, you knew where you were by the aroma drifting from the galley. It was a rich, savory scent, fried seal steaks sizzling in the pan, the yeasty smell of fresh bannock bread baking in the oven, and the dark, bitter perfume of strong coffee. The ship was cold in the mornings, though not freezing. The stove had been banked down for the night, glowing only faintly. The first task was to stoke it. The Peggy, the man assigned to cleaning duty for the day, would take the iron poker and rattle the grate. Clank, rattle, clank. The ash would fall through, and he would shovel in fresh coal. Within minutes, the stove would roar back to life. The cast iron would begin to tick and ping as it expanded with the heat. The orange glow would return, chasing the shadows back into the corners of the room. The men would dress in the semi-darkness of the oil lamps. They pulled on thick woolen sweaters that smelled of pipe smoke and lanolin. They laced up heavy leather boots. There was a quiet murmur of "Good morning" and "Morning, boss." Breakfast was a serious affair. They sat shoulder to shoulder at the long table. The conversation was low and sleepy. The only sounds were the clinking of silverware on enameled plates and the slurping of hot tea. They ate with the hunger of men who lived in the cold. Porridge, thick and steaming. Fried seal meat, dark and rich like venison. Thick slices of bread slathered with butter. It was fuel. It was warmth.
By 9 a.m., the day had officially begun. Though it was pitch black outside, the ship hummed with industry. Shackleton believed that idleness was the enemy of sanity. He ensured that every man had a purpose, even if that purpose was invented. The scientists retreated to their laboratory. It was a small cabin filled with glass jars and brass microscopes. James Wordie, the geologist, would sit for hours examining pebbles found in the stomachs of penguins, cataloging the geology of a continent he couldn't even see. Robert Clark, the biologist, would hunch over his microscope, drawing intricate sketches of the microscopic plankton they had dredged from the ocean floor. The scratch of his pen on the paper was the only sound in the room. Scritch, scratch, scritch. In the carpenter's shop, Chippy McNeish was always busy. The shop smelled of sawdust and glue. He was building a new sledge, steaming the wood to bend it into curved runners. The rhythmic shh of his plane smoothing the ash wood was a constant, soothing percussion. For the sailors, the work was maintenance. They mended sleeping bags, sewing tears in the reindeer hide with thick needles and sinew thread. They polished the brass fittings until they gleamed like mirrors. They scrubbed the floors. It was a quiet, domestic existence. It was the routine of a monastery or library.
At 11 a.m., if the weather permitted, there was a break in the darkness. A faint gray twilight would bleed into the northern sky. It wasn't sunlight. The sun was far below the horizon, but it was enough light to see by. This was the time for exercise. The men would bundle up in their heavy parkas, wrap scarves around their faces, and head out onto the ice. Stepping off the ship was like stepping onto another planet. The silence of the Weddell Sea was vast. The ice stretched away in every direction, a landscape of white hummocks and dark shadows. They would walk in groups, their boots crunching loudly on the dry snow. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They would visit Dogville. The dogs would be waiting, standing on top of their kennels, wagging their tails. The men would play with them, wrestling in the snow, throwing balls of ice for them to chase. For an hour, the ice floe would ring with laughter and barking. Sometimes they would play soccer. The teams were arbitrary, the port watch versus the starboard watch. The pitch was a flat area of ice. The goalposts were piles of snow. The ball was heavy and frozen. They played with a desperate energy, running until their lungs burned with the cold air, sliding and falling on the slick surface. Shackleton would watch from the bridge, smoking his pipe, a smile on his face. He knew that this laughter, this movement, was what kept the darkness from entering their minds.
At 1 p.m., the twilight would fade and the night would return. The men would climb back up the gangplank, stamping the snow from their boots, and re-enter the warmth of the ship. Lunch was lighter: soup, bread, cheese. The afternoon was quiet time. The ship settled into a deep, drowsy silence. This was the time for reading. The Endurance had a surprisingly good library. The men would retreat to their bunks or sit in the wardroom armchairs. Imagine the scene. Outside, a blizzard is raging. The wind is screaming through the rigging, a high-pitched shriek that never stops. The snow is hammering against the hull like sand. But inside, it is peaceful. A man sits in a deep chair, a book in his lap. He is reading the Pickwick Papers or Britannica. He is smoking a pipe, the blue smoke drifting up to the beams. He turns a page, rustle. He takes a sip of tea, clink. The books themselves were objects of reverence. In the humid, enclosed air of the ship, they took on a specific scent, a mixture of old paper, binding glue, and the faint, sweet aroma of the tobacco smoke that had permeated their pages over the months. The library was eclectic. There were the heavy, leather-bound volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which the men treated as the ultimate arbiter of all arguments. If a debate arose about the population of India or the date of the Battle of Hastings, the oracle would be consulted. But mostly they read fiction. They read stories of green fields and crowded cities, of romance and intrigue. To open a novel was to open a window. For an hour, a man could walk the rainy streets of Dickensian London or sail the tropical seas with Conrad. He could escape the white silence. Some men read the same books over and over again. They knew the sentences by heart, but the familiarity was comforting. It was like visiting an old friend. The words on the page were a stable, unchanging anchor in a world that was literally drifting beneath their feet. He is safe. The contrast between the violence of the storm outside and the stillness of the page in front of him is the definition of cozy. To break the monotony, the men invented rituals. One of the most popular was the hair-cutting competition. In the late afternoon, the wardroom would be transformed into a barber shop. One of the men, usually Worsley, who was handy with scissors, would act as the barber. But these were not normal haircuts. The goal was to look as ridiculous as possible. One man would have his head shaved completely bald, except for a small tuft on top. Another would have a monk's tonsure, a ring of hair with a bald spot in the middle. Another would have stripes shaved into his beard. They would sit in the chair, draped in a sheet, while the others gathered around, offering suggestions and roaring with laughter. "Leave the sideburns, Worsley. Give him the Emperor Franz Josef." No, shave it all off. He looks like a billiard ball." It was silly. It was childish, but it was vital. It was a way to reclaim control over their bodies in a world where they had no control over their fate. When they looked in the mirror and saw a ridiculous stranger staring back, they laughed, and laughter was heat. Dinner was the main event of the day. The cook, Charles Green, was a genius of improvisation. He had limited ingredients: flour, sugar, tinned vegetables, and seal meat, but he worked miracles. He would make seal hoosh, a thick stew of seal meat, blubber, and oatmeal, seasoned with curry powder to hide the gamey taste. He would bake bannocks, heavy, dense scones fried in fat. On special occasions, he would open a tin of peaches or pears. The men would gather at the table, dressed in their clean clothes. The lamps were turned up high, casting a golden glow over the scene. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. Food was not just nutrition, it was entertainment. They discussed the flavor of the seal meat as if they were critics in a Paris restaurant. "A bit nutty tonight, wouldn't you say?" "Yes, quite tender. Must have been a young one." After dinner, the table was cleared. The grog was served, a small ration of hot water, sugar, and a splash of whiskey or rum. They would cup the warm mugs in their hands, inhaling the sweet steam.
Then the magic happened. Leonard Hussey would go to his cabin and return with his banjo case. A hush would fall over the room. He would sit on a crate near the stove and tune the instrument. Plink, plink, twang. And then he would play. He played the songs of the time. "It's a Long Way to Tipperary." "Goodbye, Dolly Gray." "I Hear You Calling Me." The men would join in. At first, just a hum. Then a few voices singing the chorus, and finally, the whole room would be singing. The atmosphere in the wardroom during these sing-songs was thick, almost tangible. The air was blue from smoke from 20 pipes and cigarettes. It swirled in the light of the oil lamps, creating a haze that softened the edges of the room. The shadows played tricks on the walls. As the men moved, Their silhouettes danced against the varnished wood, giant, distorted figures that seemed to join in the camaraderie. The temperature would rise with the body heat in the stove. Condensation would drip from the cold steel beams of the ceiling, sizzling when it hit the hot stove. Hiss. It was a humid, tropical warmth that made the men sweat in their woolens. They would roll up their sleeves, revealing tattoos and scars, their faces flushed and happy. For a stranger looking in through the porthole, it would have seemed impossible that this scene was taking place in the middle of a frozen ocean. It looked like a tavern on a Saturday night. It sounded like a party. It felt like life. They sang loud. They sang to drown out the wind. They sang to remember who they were. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second in command, had a terrible voice but sang with immense enthusiasm. Tom Crean would tap his massive foot on the floorboards, keeping time. Sometimes the mood would turn quiet. Hussey would play a slow, melancholic Scottish ballad. The men would stop singing and just listen. They would stare into the middle distance, their eyes unfocused. In those moments, they were not on a ship trapped in the ice. They were back in a pub in London. They were in a farmhouse in Ireland. They were sitting by a fireplace in New Zealand. The music was a time machine. By 10 p.m., the energy would wind down. The lamps were dimmed. The men began to prepare for bed. They would climb into their bunks, pulling the heavy woolen curtains closed. The ship settled. The timbers creaked as the temperature dropped. In the darkness of his bunk, a man would lie on his back, listening. He would hear the footsteps of the night watchman pacing the deck above his head. Thump, thump, thump. He would hear the distant howl of a dog in Dogville. He would hear the wind buffeting the side of the ship. But he was warm. He was full. He was safe. He would pull the blankets up to his chin, close his eyes, and let the gentle, imperceptible drift of the ice carry him into sleep. Another day had passed. Another day of the long winter was done, and the endurance still held them. By 10 p.m., the energy would wind down. The lamps were dimmed. The men began to prepare for bed. They would climb into their bunks, pulling the heavy woolen curtains closed. The ship settled. The timbers creaked as the temperature dropped. In the darkness of his bunk, a man would lie on his back, listening. He would hear the footsteps of the night watchman pacing the deck above his head. Thump, thump, thump. He would hear the distant howl of a dog in Dogville. He would hear the wind buffeting the side of the ship. But he was warm. He was full. He was safe. He would pull the blankets up to his chin, close his eyes, and let the gentle, imperceptible drift of the ice carry him into sleep. Another day had passed. Another day of the long winter was done, and the endurance still held them.
August brought the sun back. At first, it was a cause for celebration. The return of the light meant the end of the long night. It meant they could see the horizon again. It meant hope. But the sun brought a hidden enemy. As the temperature rose slightly, the ice pack began to wake up. The great frozen continent of the Weddell Sea, which had been locked in a silent, solid embrace for months, began to breathe. The first sign was the noise. During the winter, the silence had been absolute. Now a low, distant rumble began to permeate the air. It sounded like a heavy train moving on a track miles away. Rum, bum, bum. It was the sound of millions of tons of ice shifting, grinding, and colliding. The pressure ridges, great walls of broken ice, began to form. They would rise up from the flat flow, blocks of ice the size of houses being pushed into the air by invisible, irresistible forces. The Endurance was no longer in a safe harbor. She was in a vice.
The ship began to talk. As the pressure mounted against her hull, the wood began to complain. It started with small sounds. A sharp crack like a pistol shot would ring out in the middle of the night, waking the men. A door that had always opened easily would suddenly jam, the frame twisted by the warping hull. Then the sounds grew louder. Imagine living inside a giant wooden instrument that is being slowly crushed. The massive oak beams, 2 feet thick, would groan under the strain. It was a deep guttural sound, like a living creature in pain. The floorboards would ripple. You could stand in the wardroom and feel the deck moving beneath your feet, vibrating as the ice squeezed the ship's ribs. The men tried to ignore it. They played their cards louder, they sang their songs with more volume. But the fear was there, lurking in the corners of their eyes. They knew the strength of the ship. They knew she was the strongest wooden vessel ever built. But they also knew that nothing made by human hands could withstand the power of the shifting polar cap.
In October 1915, the attack began in earnest. The ice didn't strike once and retreat. It was a siege. A massive floe on the starboard side began to press against the ship, while another on the port side held firm. The Endurance was caught in the middle. The men fought back. They were not passengers, they were her crew. When the water began to seep into the hold, they manned the pumps. For days, the rhythm of their life became the rhythm of the pump. Clank, whoosh, clank, whoosh. They worked in shifts, standing in the freezing bilge water, their arms aching, their breath coming in gasps. They pumped until they were exhausted, then slept for a few hours, then pumped again. The act of pumping became a trance. It was a brutal, repetitive motion that consumed the mind. Up, down, up, down. The handles of the bilge pumps were cold iron, biting through the wool of their mittens.
The water that gushed out onto the deck was not liquid, it was slush. It froze almost instantly upon hitting the air, creating a slick, treacherous glaze of ice on the tilting deck. The men slipped and slid as they worked, their boots struggling for purchase. The sound of the pump was the only thing that drowned out the groaning of the ship. It was a rhythmic clank, whoosh, that became the tempo of their survival. They sang songs to keep the rhythm, their voices hoarse and strained. They told jokes that weren't funny, just to hear a human sound. But the water kept rising. It was a cold, black tide creeping up from the bottom of the ship, swallowing the coal bunkers, then the engine room, then the lower decks. It was a slow, suffocating death for the vessel. They built cofferdams, wooden barriers to try and stem the flow. Chippy McNeish was everywhere, nailing planks, caulking seams, trying to heal the wounds of the ship. But the ice was relentless.
On October 24th, the pressure reached a crescendo. The ship was lifted bodily out of the water. She listed heavily to the port side, leaning over at a crazy angle. Inside, everything slid. Books tumbled from the shelves. Plates crashed to the floor. The stove, their warm, glowing heart, had to be put out to prevent a fire. The warmth vanished. The lights went out. The ship was cold, dark, and dying. The sound of the final days was terrifying. It wasn't just creaking anymore. It was screaming. As the pressure increased, the heavy green heart planking on the outside of the hull began to splinter. The sound was like a shriek, a high-pitched tearing noise that set the teeth on edge. Scree! Then came the snapping of the beams. These were massive timbers, thick as a man's waist. When they broke, it sounded like artillery fire. Boom! The ship would shudder violently. The men stood on the leaning deck, helpless. They watched as the deck planks buckled and sprang upwards, the nails popping out like bullets. They watched as the masts whipped back and forth. The Endurance was being crushed. She was being strangled.
On October 27th at 5 p.m., Shackleton made the decision. He had walked the deck. He had looked at the twisted rudder. He had listened to the water rushing into the hold. He knew it was over. He gathered the men on the tilting deck. The wind was blowing snow into their faces. The temperature was 15 below. He spoke quietly. There was no melodrama. "She's going, boys. It's time to get off." It was the end of the world they had known for a year. The evacuation was orderly. There was no panic. They had practiced this. They began to move their lives onto the ice. They lowered the lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills onto the floe. They brought out the sleeping bags, the tents, the food crates. They brought out the banjo. They moved the dogs. The animals were confused, sensing the tension. They whined and pulled at their chains as they were led away from the ship that had been their shelter. They set up a camp on a sturdy floe about 100 yards from the ship. They called it Dump Camp.
That night, the men did not sleep. They lay in their tents on the ice, listening. The sound of the ship dying carried clearly across the frozen air. It was a continuous series of crashes and groans. Shackleton did not sleep. He paced the ice between the tents and the ship. He watched the vessel that had been his dream, his responsibility, and his home being destroyed. From the ice, the Endurance looked tragic. She was illuminated by the moonlight, a dark, broken silhouette against the white snow. She was listing badly, her masts tangled in the rigging. To watch her like this was to watch a friend in agony. The Endurance had been more than a machine. She had been a living thing. She had sheltered them from the gales, kept them warm with her coal, and held them safe in her wooden belly. Now she looked like a ghost. The ice had crushed her sides in, giving her a pinched, skeletal appearance. Her spars, once so proud and straight, were snapped and hanging at odd angles, like broken limbs. The moonlight played across the wreckage, casting long, twisted shadows on the snow. Every now and then, a piece of rigging would snap under the tension. Ping! A sharp, lonely sound that echoed in the silence. The men stood in small groups, speaking in whispers. They remembered the warmth of the wardroom, the smell of the galley, the sound of the banjo. All of those memories were now trapped inside that broken hull, sinking slowly into the freezing water. It was a grief as sharp and real as losing a member of the crew. Then the lights went out. For months, the portholes of the Endurance had been glowing squares of yellow light, a beacon of warmth in the dark. Now, one by one, as the water rose inside and the fires were drowned, the windows went dark. The ship became a tomb. The end did not happen all at once. The ship lingered for weeks, a broken wreck held up by the ice. But the final moment, when it came, was absolute. It was November 21st, 1915. "She's going, boys!" someone shouted. The men rushed out of their tents. The ice had opened up. The crushed hull of the Endurance, heavy with water, began to slide. She went down bow first. The stern rose into the air, the propeller hanging motionless against the sky for a brief second. The British ensign, the flag they had flown with such pride, fluttered once in the wind, and then she slid beneath the ice. There was a gurgle of air, a swirl of slush, and then nothing. The ice closed over the spot where she had been. The white surface was unbroken. It was as if she had never existed. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the winter. The winter silence had been peaceful, a silence of waiting. This was a silence of exposure. The men stood on the ice floe. They were 28 men, standing on a sheet of frozen water, thousands of miles from civilization, with no ship, no radio, and no hope of rescue. They looked at each other. They looked at the small pile of crates and the 3 small boats. They were no longer sailors. They were castaways. Shackleton looked at them. He knew that despair was the killer now. He straightened his back. He lit a cigarette. "So," he said, his voice calm and steady, "ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." He turned away from the grave of the Endurance and looked north. The cozy winter was over. The Ritz was gone. The long drift was done. When the Endurance finally slipped beneath the ice, the world of the 28 men shrank. It shrank from a sturdy wooden ship to a collection of 5 thin canvas tents pitched on a floating raft of ice. They called it Ocean Camp. It was a fragile existence. The ice floe they lived on was 1.5 miles square, a large piece of real estate in the frozen ocean, but a tiny speck in the universe. Beneath their boots, beneath 5 feet of ice, lay 2,000 fathoms of dark, freezing water. Life in the tents was a study in intimacy. The tents were small, pyramid-shaped structures made of linen. Inside, the men slept shoulder to shoulder, packed together like sardines in a tin. This closeness was their survival. In the bitter cold of the Antarctic night, the only source of heat was the man lying next to you. They developed a sleeping rhythm. When one man turned over, everyone had to turn over. "Turn!" someone would whisper in the darkness, and the whole row of sleeping bags would rustle and shift in unison. The soundscape of Ocean Camp was dominated by the wind. On the ship, the wind had been a distant howl outside the thick timber walls. Here, it was right against your ear. The canvas walls would snap and flutter, flap, 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 a constant rhythmic percussion. When the blizzard blew hard, the sides of the tent would bow in, pressing against the men inside, as if the storm was trying to come in and join them. But inside the sleeping bags, it was warm. These were high-quality bags, made of reindeer fur, with the hair facing inward. They trapped the body heat effectively. To crawl into the bag after a watch on the ice, to pull the fur hood tight around your face until only your nose was exposed, was a moment of pure bliss. It was a cocoon, a private, warm universe in a world of cold. Days at ocean camp were defined by a slow, hypnotic routine. Without the ship to maintain, the work became simpler, more primal. The center of the camp was the galley. It wasn't a room anymore. It was a stove built out of oil drums and stray pieces of metal, sheltered by a wall of snow blocks. Here, the cook, Charles Green, performed his daily miracles. The fuel was no longer coal. It was blubber. They hunted the seals that popped up in the leads around the floe. The blubber, the thick layer of fat, burned with a fierce, hot flame, but it produced a thick, oily black smoke. The smell of ocean camp was the smell of this smoke. It permeated everything. It soaked into their clothes, their hair, their skin. It was a heavy, organic scent, like burning oil and musk. It wasn't unpleasant to them. It was the smell of life. It meant hot food. Breakfast was at 8 a.m., lunch at 1 p.m., dinner at 5 p.m. The menu was monotonous: seal steak and hoosh, a stew made of pemmican, dried meat and fat and water. But to hungry men, it was a feast. They would sit on their sleeping bags, holding their tin mugs, savoring the warmth of the stew, spreading through their chests. They became connoisseurs of water. On the ice floe, fresh water was a precious commodity. They had to chop blocks of old ice that had been frozen for so long the salt had leached out of it, and melt it over the blubber stove. The sound of the ice melting was a constant background noise in the galley. Hiss, drip, drip. The transition from solid to liquid, the alchemy of turning the frozen world into something they could drink.
The greatest enemy at ocean camp was not the temperature itself, but the dampness. On the ship, the cold had been dry. Here, the heat of their bodies melted the snow beneath them. The floor of the tent was a sodden mess of reindeer hair and slush. At night, the sleeping bags would freeze. The moisture from their breath would turn to ice around the hood. In the morning, waking up meant breaking out of a shell of ice. But the human body is a marvel of adaptation. The men stopped shivering. Their blood thickened. They grew beards that covered their faces, the hair trapping a layer of warm air against the skin. They became creatures of the ice, as adapted to the environment as the seals they hunted. They learned to read the ice. They knew the difference between the sharp crack of a harmless thermal fracture and the deep, booming groan of a pressure ridge forming. They knew that a dark sky on the horizon meant open water, water sky, and a bright white sky meant solid pack, ice blink. They were drifting. The entire floe was moving north, carried by the Weddell Gyre current. They were traveling, but they were standing still. It was a paradox. They would go to sleep in one spot and wake up 5 miles away without ever taking a step.
In December, they tried to march. They loaded the lifeboats onto sledges and tried to drag them across the ice toward land. It was a disaster. The ice was a chaotic jumble of pressure ridges and soft snow. They pulled until their hearts hammered against their ribs, sinking up to their waists in slush. In 7 days, they moved only 7 miles. Shackleton, seeing the exhaustion in their eyes, made a hard choice.
"It's no good, boys," he said. "We'll stop here." They pitched the tents again. They called this new home Patience Camp. The name was perfect. For 3.5 months, they did nothing but wait. Waiting is a skill. It requires a slowing down of the mind. The men entered a state of hibernation. They spent hours just sitting, watching the horizon. They watched the light change on the snow. They watched the clouds form and dissolve. They watched the killer whales cruising in the leads, their black fins cutting the gray water. They played cards. The deck of cards became soft and woolly from constant use, the corners rounded, the faces of the kings and queens obscured by blubber stains. They played bridge, poker, and patience. The slap of a card on a wooden crate, thwack, was the loudest sound in the tent. They read. The few books they had saved from the ship were passed around like holy relics. They read aloud to each other in the evenings. The words of the Bible or a poetry anthology would drift out of the tent and be swallowed by the vast silence of the Antarctic.
By March 1916, the ice began to change. They had drifted north, out of the deep freeze of the Weddell Sea and into the warmer waters of the open ocean. The solid plain of ice began to fracture. The floe they were living on, once a mile wide, began to crack. Pieces broke off. The camp grew smaller. The sound of the ocean returned. The swell, the long rolling waves of the Atlantic, began to lift the ice. Heave, drop, heave, drop. It was a gentle motion, like a giant breathing beneath them. But it was terrifying. It meant the ice was breaking up. On April 8th, the end of the waiting arrived. It happened at lunch. The men were eating their stew when a sudden crack split the air, louder than a cannon shot. The ice floor beneath the tent split open. A dark line of water appeared, widening rapidly. "Strike the tents!" Shackleton shouted. The camp exploded into action. The lethargy of the last few months vanished. Men scrambled to pack the sleeping bags, the stove, the food crates. They moved everything to a larger piece of ice, but that piece cracked too. The ocean was waking up. The ice was dissolving. The solid ground they had trusted for a year was turning back into water. On April 9th, the moment came. A lead of open water opened up in front of them, a dark, inviting road leading north. "Launch the boats!" The 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, were pushed to the edge of the ice. They were heavy, laden with supplies. The men waded into the freezing water, guiding the boats off the ice. One by one, they climbed aboard. The feeling of being in a boat after a year on the solid ice was disorienting. The boat rocked and swayed. It felt alive, unstable. They took up the oars. Splash, pull, splash, pull. They rowed away from the remains of Patience Camp, a few bloodstains on the snow where they had butchered seals, a pile of discarded gear. They were no longer residents of the ice. They were sailors again. But they were tiny. The boats were 22 feet long. The waves were 10 feet high. The ocean was gray and cold and endless. As they rowed, the ice floes bobbed around them, white ghosts in the mist. The water hissed along the wooden strakes. They were adrift. The waiting was over. The struggle for the land had begun. For 7 days, the 3 small boats fought their way through the dying ice pack. It was a chaotic, wet purgatory.
They rode through narrow leads that closed behind them like jaws. They hauled the boats onto ice floes at night to sleep, only to have the floes crack beneath them. But finally, they broke through. On April 15th, they reached the open ocean. The ice was behind them, a white line on the horizon that slowly faded into the mist. Ahead lay the gray, heaving expanse of the Southern Ocean. They set a course for Elephant Island, a desolate rock in the South Shetland chain. It was a grim, inhospitable place, but it was solid land, and for men who had not stood on rock or soil for 497 days, it was the promised land. They landed on a narrow pebble beach. The moment the keels of the boats grated against the stones, scrah! Some of the men fell to their knees. They picked up handfuls of the gray pebbles and let them run through their fingers. They laughed, they cried. They drank from a glacial stream, the water sweet and cold, tasting of minerals and earth. But Elephant Island was a trap. It was far from the shipping lanes. No one would ever look for them there. To stay was to starve. Shackleton knew there was only one hope. He had to take a boat and sail across the worst ocean in the world to South Georgia, where the whaling stations were. It was a journey of 800 miles across the Drake Passage in winter in a 22-foot lifeboat. He chose the James Caird. It was the strongest of the 3 boats built of Norwegian pine, but it was still an open boat. To make it seaworthy, Chippy McNeish, the carpenter, performed his masterpiece. Using wood from the packing crates and the runners of the sledges, he built a makeshift deck over the boat. He covered it with canvas, sealing the seams with lamp wick and seal blood because they had no tar. It was a fragile shell, but it turned the open boat into a covered vessel. Shackleton chose 5 men to go with him: Worsley, the navigator; Crean, the giant Irishman; McNeish, the carpenter; and 2 sailors, McCarthy and Vincent. On Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916, they launched. The men remaining on the island stood on the beach and waved. They watched the James Caird rise on a swell, a tiny speck of white canvas against the gray water, and then disappear into the mist. The Southern Ocean is not like other oceans. It is the only band of water on Earth that circles the globe unobstructed by land. The winds, known as the roaring 40s and the furious 50s, blow without ceasing, building waves of immense size. These waves are called Cape Horn rollers. They are not steep, breaking waves like you see on a beach. They are vast, moving hills of water. They can be a mile long from crest to crest and 50 feet high. For the 6 men in the James C. Caird, the world became a world of vertical motion. The boat would be lifted up the face of a wave. It felt like riding an elevator. At the top, on the crest, they would hang for a moment in the wind, looking out over a landscape of moving gray mountains. Then they would slide down the back of the wave, a long, dizzying descent into the trough. Down, down, down. The walls of water would rise up on either side, blocking out the horizon, blocking out the sun. In the trough, it was quiet. The wind passed over their heads. Then the next wave would come, and the lift would begin again. Rise, hang, fall. Rise, hang, fall. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic cycle. It never stopped. Day and night, for 16 days, this was their reality. The boat was a cradle, rocked by the hand of a giant. Life inside the boat was a study in confinement. The makeshift deck that McNeish had built created a small, dark space below. It was about the size of a large dining table, but with only 2 feet of headroom. This was the cabin. 3 men would be on watch in the cockpit, steering and handling the sails, while the other 3 slept below. To enter the cabin, you had to crawl on your belly over the ballast stones, heavy rocks they had put in the bottom of the boat for stability. It was dark, wet, and smelled of wet wool, reindeer fur, and unwashed bodies. But it was shelter. Lying there in the dark, listening to the water hammering against the thin wooden planks, thud, thud, splash, was a strange experience. You were inches away from death, separated from the freezing ocean by a layer of pine wood no thicker than a book. But the human mind adapts. The noise became white noise. The motion became a lullaby. They slept in a tangle of limbs. It was impossible to lie straight. They curled around each other like puppies, sharing body heat. When the boat rolled, they rolled together. They entered a trance state. They weren't fully awake, and they weren't fully asleep. They were suspended in a gray limbo.
On deck, the experience was visceral. The helmsman sat in the small open cockpit at the stern. He held the tiller ropes, his eyes fixed on the waves coming out of the darkness. It was freezing. The spray from the waves would fly over the boat, freezing instantly on everything it touched. The rigging grew thick with ice. The deck became a skating rink. Every few hours, the men had to crawl out onto the slippery, pitching deck with axes to chip away the ice. If they didn't, the weight of the ice would capsize the boat. Chip, chip, chip. The sound of the axe on the wood was a sharp staccato rhythm against the roar of the wind. Worsley, the navigator, had the hardest job. To find South Georgia, a tiny speck in a massive ocean, he needed to see the sun or the stars, but the sky was almost always covered in thick gray clouds. He would stand in the cockpit, hugging the mast with one arm, his sextant in the other hand. He would wait for the boat to reach the crest of a wave. For a split second, the horizon would be visible. He would try to snap a reading. He did this day after day, balancing on a cork in a washing machine, doing trigonometry in his head. It was a feat of navigation that borders on the miraculous.
By the 7th day, a new enemy appeared: thirst. They had 2 casks of fresh water. One of them had been damaged during the loading. Salt water had gotten in. The water was brackish, salty, and nauseating. They couldn't drink it. Their throats became dry and swollen. Their tongues felt like leather. They stopped eating because they couldn't swallow the dry pemmican. Thirst is a quiet torture. It dominates the mind. They dreamed of rivers. They dreamed of the sound of rain. In the cave, they would whisper to each other about beverages. "I'd like a pot of tea," Crean would rasp, "hot and sweet." "No, a glass of cold milk with ice in it," the sound of the ocean would say. Water, water everywhere became a mockery. The spray that hit their faces was salt. The waves that lifted them were salt. They sucked on small pieces of frozen seal meat to try and generate saliva. They held ice in their mouths until it melted.
On the night of May 8th, the ocean tried to kill them one last time. Shackleton was at the tiller. It was midnight. He looked back and saw a clearing in the clouds to the south, a line of white light. "The sky's clearing, boys," he called out. But a moment later he realized his mistake. It wasn't the sky, it was the white foam crest of a rogue wave, a giant. It stretched across the entire horizon, towering above the others. It moved with a terrifying silence. "Hold on! For God's sake, hold on!" Shackleton shouted. The wave struck. The James Caird was lifted up, not gently this time, but violently. She was thrown forward into the foaming chaos. The water buried her. For a few seconds they were underwater. The cockpit filled. The men were gasping, choking. They thought it was the end. But the boat rose. She shook herself like a dog, the water pouring off her decks. She had survived. The men bailed frantically. They used the pot, the sleeping bags, their hats, anything to get the water out. They worked with the energy of the desperate. When the boat was finally empty, they collapsed. They lit the small Primus stove. They made hot milk. It was the best drink of their lives.
On May 8th, the same day as the wave, a piece of kelp floated past the boat. Kelp meant land. Then a bird appeared, a shag. Shags never venture far from shore. The mood in the boat shifted. The lethargy vanished. They strained their eyes against the gray mist. And then, through a break in the clouds, they saw it. Black cliffs, snow-capped peaks. South Georgia. It was real. It was there. But the ocean wasn't done. A hurricane struck that night. For 9 hours they were battered by winds of hurricane force. They were blown toward the cliffs, then blown away. They were in the washing machine again. But they held on. On the morning of May 10th, the wind died. The sea calmed. They steered the boat into a small inlet called King Haakon Bay. The sound of the keel hitting the sand was the sweetest sound in the world. Crunch. They crawled out of the boat. They were weak, dehydrated, frostbitten. Their legs wouldn't support them. They fell onto the beach. But they were alive. There was a stream running down the beach, fresh, glacial water. They crawled to it. They put their faces in the water and drank. They drank until they couldn't drink anymore. It was cold, pure, and life-giving. They had done the impossible. They had sailed 800 miles in a lifeboat through the worst winter in the Antarctic. That night they slept on the solid earth. No rocking, no pitching. Just the steady, unmoving ground beneath them. They slept the sleep of the dead. They were on land, but they were not safe. As the 6-man recovered on the beach of King Haakon Bay, drinking from the glacial stream and eating albatross chicks, a hard truth settled over them. They were on the wrong side of the island. South Georgia is a spine of mountains rising out of the sea. The whaling stations, the people, the ships, the rescue were on the north coast. The James Caird had landed on the south coast. Between them and Salvation lay 30 miles of unmapped glaciers, jagged peaks, and snowfields. No human being had ever crossed the interior of South Georgia. It was considered impossible. But the boat was too damaged to sail around. They had to walk. Shackleton looked at his men. McNeish and Vincent were too weak to walk. McCarthy was exhausted. He chose Worsley and Crean to go with him, the 3 strongest. They prepared for the climb. They took a length of rope, an adze, a carpenter's axe for cutting steps in the ice, and a small Primus stove. They put screws from the lifeboat into the soles of their boots to act as crampons. On the night of May 19th, the moon was full. The weather was clear. "We go now," Shackleton said. They left the others under the overturned boat and began to climb. The crossing of South Georgia is a dreamscape. Imagine climbing a mountain by moonlight. The snow was hard and crisp. The peaks around them were sharp black triangles against a sky of deep, starry velvet. They climbed in silence. The only sound was the crunch of their boots and the rhythmic chip-chip of the adze cutting steps into the ice. The landscape they moved through was alien. South Georgia is a spine of rock thrust up from the ocean floor, and the glaciers here are ancient. In the moonlight, the ice glowed with a spectral internal light, shades of pale blue and gray that seemed to pulse in the darkness. The wind played tricks on their ears as it whistled through the jagged peaks of the Trident Ridge. It sounded like distant voices. Sometimes it sounded like a woman calling. Sometimes it sounded like the whistle of a ship. They would stop and listen, straining their ears against the silence, only to realize it was just the air moving over stone.
The physical rhythm of the march became a trance. Step, breathe. Step, breathe. The screws in their boots bit into the hard ice with a satisfying crunch. They were 3 tiny black figures moving across a vast white sheet of paper. They were so high up that the clouds were below them, a sea of white cotton rolling in the valleys. It felt as if they were walking in the sky. They reached the top of a ridge, hoping to see a way down, but below them was only fog and vertical cliffs. They had to retrace their steps. Down, then up again. They did this again and again. It was a maze of ice. At the top of a razorback ridge, the fog began to close in behind them. Night was falling again. If they stayed on the ridge, they would freeze to death. Shackleton looked down into the darkness. He couldn't see the bottom of the slope. It might be a gentle slide. It might be a cliff. "We have to slide," he said. It was madness to slide down an unknown mountain in the dark. They sat on their coiled ropes like sledges. They locked their arms around each other. Shackleton in front, Worsley in the middle, Crean at the back. They pushed off. Whoosh! They gathered speed. The wind roared in their ears. The snow flew up in their faces. They were falling through the darkness, trusting gravity, trusting fate. They slid for a minute, an eternity. Then the slope leveled out. They slowed down. They came to a stop in a bank of soft snow at the bottom. They stood up, shaking the snow from their clothes. They were alive. They had descended 1,500 feet in 60 seconds. They laughed. It was the laughter of relief, echoing in the silent valley. It was the first mechanical sound they had heard in 2 years. It was the sound of the 20th century. It was the sound of civilization. They looked at each other. Their bearded, frost-bitten faces cracked into smiles. "We've done it," Shackleton whispered. The final descent was through a waterfall. They were too tired to climb down the rocks, so they lowered themselves through the freezing water. They walked into the outskirts of the whaling station. They looked like monsters. Their hair hung to their shoulders, matted and greasy. Their beards were tangled thickets. Their clothes were rags,
black with blubber smoke and dirt. They smelled of seal blood and death. 2 young boys saw them and ran away screaming. They walked to the station manager's house. Torov Solnay, the manager, came to the door. He looked at these 3 wild men. He didn't recognize them. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. Shackleton straightened his back. He tried to stand tall in his rags. "My name is Shackleton," he said softly. "We have lost our ship." Sorley stared at him. Then tears filled his eyes. He stepped forward and took Shackleton's hand. "Come in," he said. "Come in." The sensory experience of that first hour back in civilization was overwhelming. They were led into a warm room, a real room, with wallpaper and carpet. They were given hot coffee, not seal hoosh, but coffee, with sugar and milk and cakes. Then the bath. They stripped off the rags they had worn for a year. They sank into tubs of hot water. The heat soaked into their bones, melting the ice that had been in their marrow for so long. They scrubbed the blubber soot from their skin. They shaved the beards.
The sensation of the hot water was almost hallucinatory. For 2 years, their skin had known only the bite of the wind, the sting of salt spray, and the friction of wet wool. Now the water felt like liquid silk. It loosened muscles that had been clenched in a permanent shiver since 1914. As they sat in the tubs, the station manager brought them fresh clothes. The texture of the fabric was a revelation. They touched the cotton shirts with wonder. They ran their hands over the smooth weave of the trousers. After months of wearing stiff, frozen, blubber-soaked rags that chafed the skin raw, the softness of clean laundry felt like the height of luxury. The smells of the room were overwhelming. To a nose accustomed only to the smell of ice and seal blood, the house was a symphony of scents. The aroma of beeswax polish on the furniture, the scent of old books, the faint, sweet smell of dried lavender in the linen, the rich, dark smell of the coffee brewing. It was a sensory overload that made them dizzy with pleasure. They put on clean clothes, soft cotton, wool that didn't smell of smoke. That night they slept in beds, real beds with sheets and pillows. Worsley couldn't sleep. He woke up in the middle of the night, terrified by the silence. He missed the sound of the waves. He missed the grinding of the ice. He had to get out of bed and sleep on the floor to feel comfortable. But they were safe.
The story wasn't over. Shackleton was not a man to leave a job unfinished. He had left 22 men on Elephant Island. On that desolate spit of rock, the 22 men were living a life of grim monotony. They were sheltering under the 2 remaining overturned boats, the Dudley Docker and the Stancomb Wills. They had raised the boats on stone walls to create a low, dark hut. Inside, it was a cave of soot and darkness. They burned blubber lamps that filled the air with oily black smoke. Their faces were blackened, their eyes white circles in masks of soot. Every day, Frank Wild, whom Shackleton had left in charge, would perform the same ritual. He would crawl out of the hut, stand on the pebble beach, and look north. "Roll up your sleeping bags, boys," he would shout, his voice cracking with false cheer. "The boss may come today." He said it every single morning for 4 months. Even when the pack ice was thick on the horizon. Even when the gales blew. He kept the flame of belief alive when there was no fuel left to feed it.
They watched the horizon until their eyes watered, looking for a smudge of smoke. A mast, anything that wasn't ice.
For 4 months, he tried to get back to them. He borrowed ships. He was turned back by the pack ice 3 times. The winter was too strong. But he didn't give up. Finally, in August 1916, aboard a Chilean tug called the Yelko, he broke through. As they approached the beach on Elephant Island, Shackleton peered through his binoculars. He counted the tiny figures standing on the shore. 1, 2, 3. He counted them all. "They are all there," he shouted. "They are all there." The rescue was quick. The men were pulled off the beach. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and smelling of smoke, but they were alive. Not a single life had been lost.
And so, the Endurance expedition ended. They had failed in their goal. They never crossed the continent. They lost their ship. They brought back no scientific discoveries of great note, but they brought back something else. They brought back a story of what human beings can endure. In the years that followed, the men went back to the world. They went to war. They grew old. But a part of them always remained in the ice. They missed the simplicity of the flow. They missed the silence. In the noise and chaos of the modern world, they would close their eyes and remember the sound of the wind in the rigging. They would remember the color of the icebergs, the deep electric blue. They would remember the feeling of the sleeping bag warming up on a cold night. The Antarctic is a place of silence. It is a white, empty canvas where time seems to stop.
The Endurance is still there. She lies 2 miles down in the dark, cold water of the Weddell Sea. She is perfectly preserved by the cold. The starfish crawl across her deck. The sea anemones bloom on her wheel. She is at peace. And the men are at peace. As you lie here now, warm and safe in your own bed, imagine that vast white silence. Imagine the snow falling softly, endlessly, covering the tracks of the explorers. Imagine the ice drifting slowly, turning in the great gyre of the ocean, drifting, drifting, into the white, into the quiet, into sleep.